The morning Nora Callahan signed the final papers for the acquisition of Meridian Creative Group, she wore the same watch she had been wearing for 10 years. It was a plain silver watch with a white face, the kind you buy because you need to know what time it is, not because you want anyone to notice it on your wrist. She had bought it at the clearance counter of a department store on a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks after she moved into the studio apartment on Larkin Street with one suitcase, a box of books, and the clear understanding that she was beginning again from zero at 29 years old. She needed a watch. She bought one. That was the logic of that season of her life, the stripped-down arithmetic of someone who had learned that week that the distance between what you needed and what you had been reaching for was actually survivable, and that surviving was the beginning of everything else. The attorney who handled the acquisition was a careful woman named Patricia Ellison, and she placed the documents on the conference table with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom transactions of this size had long since stopped carrying personal weight. Nora picked up the pen. She looked at the signature line where her name waited. Nora and Callahan. She signed it the way she signed everything, not fast, not with flourish, but with the deliberate attention of someone who meant what she was doing. Across the table sat a man named Gregory Walsh, the current CFO of Meridian Creative Group. Gregory was 51 years old and had the face of someone who had been managing a slow disaster for longer than he should have been asked to. He did not know that Nora knew this company from the outside before her due diligence team had opened a single file on it. He did not know she had been watching Meridian Creative Group since the day it was incorporated, 14 months after a wedding that was supposed to be hers. She signed the last page. Patricia Ellison gathered the documents. Gregory Walsh extended his hand across the table, and Nora shook it with the same steady grip she brought to every room. She thanked him. She meant it. She was not a person who thanked people she did not mean to thank. On the way out of the building, crossing the lobby toward the glass front doors and the November street beyond them, she passed a mirror along the far wall, the long rectangular kind that office buildings install to make lobbies feel larger than they are. She caught her own eye without meaning to. A woman in a dark coat, silver coming into the hair at her temples, a plain watch on her wrist. 39 years old. Someone who had been broken apart very carefully once, by people who knew exactly where the fault lines were, and who had put herself back together without anyone fully understanding how long that work had taken or how much of it had been done alone, in silence, in the specific hours between midnight and morning when there was nobody watching and no reason to perform anything for anyone. She pushed through the glass doors. The November air came at her, cold and without ceremony. She turned her collar up and let herself, just for one moment, think about where all of this had started. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Callahan family house was a white colonial on Birchwood Drive in a suburb 20 minutes from the city, and Nora had grown up in it the way children grow up in houses they do not choose, with the complete and unself-conscious knowledge of every room. She knew which stair on the back staircase creaked third from the bottom. She knew that the kitchen faucet ran warm for about 30 seconds before it told you it was going to run hot. She knew the north bedroom caught a draft in January that no amount of caulking had ever fully addressed, and she knew the particular sound the house made in deep February cold when the structure settled and the old radiators clicked in the walls. She and her sister Vivian had been raised in that house by their parents, Carl and Margaret Callahan. Nora came first. Vivian came 5 years later. Their father was a civil engineer who worked long hours and came home with the specific quiet of a man who had spent his thinking capacity on calculations and had very little left for conversation. A man who loved his daughters in the way of someone who had decided that love was demonstrated through provision and was not entirely certain what else it required of him. Their mother, Margaret, was more present and more complicated. She had been a high school English teacher before she left work to raise the children, and she had the kind of intelligence that runs fast without sufficient outlet and that tends, in the absence of proper channel, to concentrate itself on whatever is nearest. In Margaret's case, that was her household and her 2 daughters, both of which she managed with an attention so thorough it sometimes felt less like warmth and more like weather. The dynamic between the sisters was one that anyone who spent 20 minutes observing them could have mapped accurately, though neither would have accepted the map as fair. Nora was the steady one, the responsible one, The one who came home with good grades and helped with dishes without being asked and found a part-time job at 16 and put half of every paycheck into a savings account because someone had told her it was a good habit and she had believed them. She was not the pretty one, and she understood this by the time she was in 7th grade, not because anyone said it directly, but because she had learned to read rooms and rooms told you things. She was the kind of person who was easy to take for granted, which was different from being loved less, though from the inside the difference was not always legible. Vivian arrived 5 years behind her as the kind of child who seemed to understand from a very early age that the world responded well to warmth and ease and the performance of those things, whether or not they came naturally. She was bright in a sideways direction, not toward grades and savings accounts, but toward people, toward reading what a person wanted and giving it to them in a way that made them feel she had done them a personal favor. She made adults describe her as delightful. She had perfected that description by the time she was 10. She also had a quality that Nora observed over many years and never quite named, a specific patience with things she wanted. She did not grab. She waited, found the right moment and the right presentation, and moved at precisely the time when moving was most likely to succeed. When their mother died, Nora was 26 and Vivian was 21. Margaret had a heart attack in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning in October, the kind that does not give warning and does not give time. She was there, and then she was not, and the house on Birchwood Drive without Margaret in it was a different kind of structure entirely, colder in ways that had nothing to do with the draft in the north bedroom. Margaret had been careful with money all her life, in the way of someone who understands it as a form of security against the things that can happen without warning. She left a will that was specific and witnessed and not ambiguous. The estate went primarily to Carl. Of the portion divided between the daughters, the split was 60 to Nora and 40 to Vivian. Margaret had never explained this division aloud, but Nora understood it to be a quiet acknowledgement of something her mother had seen clearly but chosen not to say directly, which was the particular arithmetic of who between the two of them had been doing what, and for how long. At the time of Margaret's death, the will was filed and accepted and no one contested it. The dispute came later, as certain disputes do, when the circumstances that made it possible had been carefully prepared by someone who understood that preparation was most effective when it looked like nothing at all. Nora met Daniel Marsh at a mutual friend's dinner party in the spring. She turned 26, for months before her mother died. He was 31 and worked in corporate sales and had the kind of confidence that reads well in a room, the variety that makes you feel, when it is directed at you, that you are interesting and worth attending to. He was not obviously handsome, but he became so over the course of a conversation, which Nora later thought was the more effective kind of handsome because you did not defend against it the same way. He remembered things. He asked specific follow-up questions at the next opportunity. He had been listening, actually listening, and in a life where she had often felt like the most forgettable person in any given room, that quality in him was not nothing. They dated for 2 years. He met her family at Christmas of the first year, and her father liked him, shaking his hand with the firm approval of a man who recognized someone organized and purposeful. Vivian declared him lovely and paid him the particular quality of attention Nora had seen her give things she found worth wanting, a slightly elevated brightness, a focus that sat differently from her usual social ease. Nora noticed it the way she noticed most things about Vivian, and she placed it in the category she had maintained for years, the one that held observations she did not want to draw conclusions from. Daniel proposed on a Tuesday evening in March in the apartment they had been sharing for 6 months. He had made her favorite dinner, roasted chicken with lemon and herbs, and afterward he produced a ring from the kitchen drawer where he kept batteries and spare keys and other things not yet assigned a permanent home. He did not make a speech. He said he wanted to do this right, and the right way was to ask her directly. The ring was silver with a small sapphire, not extravagant. She liked it better for that. They set the date for the following October. 14 months to plan it properly, without turning it into something so large it forgot what it was for. Nora kept a spreadsheet. She had vendors contacted, deposits paid, address altered twice, and hanging in the back of the closet in a cloth bag. She had a venue, a small event space at a winery 40 minutes outside the city with a terrace that faced east and a stone wine cellar that could be used as a cocktail room. She had a guest list of 83 people, a seating chart, and 3 versions of the ceremony wording, because she wanted the words to be worth saying and not merely ceremonial. She was happy. It is worth saying that plainly. She was genuinely and specifically happy in the way that lives on the other side of having worked towards something, the kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to. She had the apartment and the man and the spreadsheet and the 83 people, and in 4 months, she would have the terrace in October light and the sapphire ring moved to the left hand. And she had her savings and her work at Whitmore & Associates where she was doing something real and being recognized for it. Her father told her that spring that he wanted to give her a wedding gift of money. A real one. He named the amount at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in April, when the sun came through the kitchen window at the angle that made everything look warmer than it was. He said he had been thinking about the business she had mentioned wanting to start someday, the small consulting firm she talked about in the careful way of someone who wants a thing so much they are afraid to say it too clearly in case the clarity becomes a jinx. He said he wanted to give her the capital to begin it properly, not on the margins. The number he named was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of number that changes what is possible on the horizon. She thanked him in the quiet way that means a gift is too large for ordinary language. She drove home and opened her laptop and made a new document and wrote the number down and looked at it for a while and then minimized the window and made dinner and went to bed. The phone calls she noticed first. Not that they were happening. Daniel and Vivian had always been friendly since that first Christmas, the easy social friendliness between a man and his fiancé's younger sister that she had never had reason to examine closely. But they became more frequent, and then they became private, and then she realized she was no longer certain where Daniel was during parts of the evening she had previously assumed she knew. She noticed this with the discomfort of someone who does not want to be noticing it, who keeps reframing each individual observation in a more innocent direction, who is expending considerable energy on explanations that protect her from the conclusion the observations are pointing toward. She asked Daniel once, conversationally, whether he had talked to Vivian recently. He said Vivian had been struggling with something, and he had been trying to be supportive. He said it without the particular quality of ease that indicates a prepared answer. She believed him. She allowed herself to believe him, which was not quite the same thing, but served the same immediate purpose. The second thing she noticed was Vivian herself. The questions about the wedding slowed and then stopped. As maid of honor, Vivian had been asking about the venue and the flowers and the dress and the ceremony wording with a frequency that was sometimes exhausting and that Nora had come to treat as a form of attention, however inconvenient. When the questions stopped, Nora told herself Vivian was busy. She told herself several things over the following months that were all, in their specific ways, methods of not looking directly at what was there to be seen. The email she did not go looking for. Daniel had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter one Thursday morning in June, 3 months before the wedding. She walked past on her way to the coffee maker and caught Vivian's name in the subject line of an open message, and she stopped. She stood at the counter, and she read it. You do not need to read all of it to understand what you are reading. You need the first sentence that tells you clearly what kind of thing this is, and then you know, and the rest is only the specific details of the thing you now understand to be true. She read the first clear sentence, and she stood at the kitchen counter for 3 minutes while the shower ran in the other room. And she put the coffee mug down and stood with her hands at her sides, and understood that the life she had been living for the past 14 months and the one she was about to live were 2 different lives, and that the line between them had been crossed without her knowledge some time ago. She closed the laptop. She went to the living room and sat down. When Daniel came out of the bathroom with a towel around his neck, drying his hair, he looked at her face and stopped moving. He held the towel still in both hands. She told him what she had seen. She told him she needed the truth. He told the truth, which was that he and Vivian had been involved since February, for months before the wedding. He said the things people say in that situation, about not having planned it, about not knowing how to stop something once it had started, about being sorry. She heard the words from a distance. The apartment was very quiet except for the specific quality of quiet that gathers in a room where something irreversible has just been said. She told him to leave. He left that evening. She called Vivian from the kitchen, sitting in one of the chairs that had been in the apartment since before Daniel, and that would remain there after him. Vivian answered on the second ring. She did not deny it. She said the things people say in that situation, about feelings and about not having planned it, and about being sorry. Then she said something Nora had not expected. She said she had already spoken to their father. She had spoken to him before Nora had been able to form a single coherent sentence. Nora understood in the beat of that information what Vivian had understood intuitively, which was that in any conflict involving the Callahan family, the person who reached Carl first had the advantage, because Carl, once he had formed an account of events, held it the way he held structural calculations, reliable, stable, and resistant to revision. Nora drove to Birchwood Drive that evening. Her father was in the kitchen, and she could see from his face when she came through the door that the conversation had already happened and the shape of it had already been fixed. He was not unkind. He said he was sorry for what she was going through. He said he believed she had been treated badly. But then he said things about not taking sides between his daughters and about the situation being complicated, and Nora understood by the time the conversation was over that the gift was not coming. Not as punishment, because the wedding was not happening, and in her father's accounting, the gift had been connected to the wedding, and when the wedding dissolved, the connection dissolved with it. She drove home. She sat in the parking lot of her building for 45 minutes before she went inside. She was not crying. She was sitting with the full assembled shape of what had happened, all of it in a single evening, and the shape was something she had never seen whole before, though its pieces had been present and observable for years. She moved out 2 weeks later. She took her clothes, her books, the coffee maker, and the kitchen knives. She found the studio on Larkin Street for $800 a month and paid the deposit from the savings account she had been contributing to since she was 16. She bought a watch at the department store clearance counter because she needed to know what time it was in the new life, and the old watch, the one with the engraving on the back, was in the apartment she had packed the suitcase from, and she was not going back for it. She went to work. Vivian married Daniel in April of the following year. The wedding was at the winery 40 minutes outside the city, on the same terrace that faced east, in the event space Nora had visited twice with a vendor to discuss logistics. She received a card from her father afterward. She read it and put it in a drawer. Their father died the following spring. He was 64 years old, and it was a stroke, early in the morning in the bedroom of the Birchwood house. He had been healthy, or seemed it. He was there, and then he was not, with the abruptness that strokes carry. Nora drove to the hospital when she got the call. She and Vivian sat in the same waiting room for 3 hours without speaking. They were both looking at the wall in front of them, and the distance between 3 feet of chair and the other person sitting in it was not measured in feet. Their father died at 2 in the morning. Nora held his hand. She told him she loved him. She said it twice. The will was read 2 weeks later in the beige office of Robert Finch, estate attorney, a man who had learned to read documents aloud in a neutral register regardless of their content. Nora had known that Vivian had moved into the Birchwood house after the wedding. She had processed that fact and filed it in the category of things she was not going to let consume her. What she had not known, because she had not asked, and asking would have required a kind of engagement with the situation she had decided she could not afford, was how thoroughly Vivian had spent that year. The house went to Vivian. A modest sum went to Nora. The rest, the body of the estate, the accumulated savings of 2 people who had lived carefully for 30 years, went to Vivian. Nora listened to the numbers. She signed where she was asked to sign. She thanked Robert Finch for his time and walked out to the parking lot. She drove home to the 1-bedroom on Caldwell Street she had moved into 8 months before. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and opened a document she had titled Things to Build. She looked at it for a long time. Then she added to it, "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She did not call Vivian. She did not write a letter or pursue a legal challenge or do any of the things people suggest when they hear the outline of what happened, the suggestions that make sense as abstractions, and that in practice would have cost her the one thing she had decided she could not spend on the wrong purpose, which was time. She had a plan on her laptop. The plan needed all of it. She had been at Whitmore and Associates for 5 years by the time her father's will was read. She was not yet a partner, but she was the analyst every partner reached for first when a case required someone who understood numbers at depth rather than on the surface. She had a reputation in the firm for a specific quality of attention. She did not miss things. Not because she was performing carefulness, but because she found the work genuinely interesting in the way you find interesting the thing you are actually built for, and real interest is its own form of rigor. 2 months after her father's estate was settled, She asked Carolyn Vance, the senior partner, whether there was a realistic path to partnership. Carolyn Vance was 54 years old and had the direct manner of someone who did not believe in softening things better said plainly. She told Nora that the path existed but was slow, that the current partners were not planning exits in the near term, and that Nora would likely be waiting 4 years at minimum. She also told her, without being asked, that if she was thinking about leaving to build something of her own, she had the skill for it, and that the worst outcome was probably not as bad as she was imagining. Nora thanked her. She went home and updated the document. She left Whitmore 18 months later. She incorporated Callahan Financial Consulting on a Thursday morning at the county clerk's office, $250 for the filing fee. She rented a desk at a shared workspace on the 4th floor of a building on Commerce Street, a narrow desk by the window with a view of a parking structure and a slice of the city beyond it. She brought her laptop, a legal pad, and 2 pens. She sat down and began. The first year was lean in the way that first years always are, which is that you have the capacity in you, but you have not yet accumulated the network of trust that brings work through the door. She took every engagement she could reach. She did small business consulting for a restaurant owner she met through a former colleague. She reviewed the books for a nonprofit that needed an outside eye on its grant allocation. She did a forensic accounting project for a law firm that paid twice the going rate and came through a referral chain she had spent 2 years building. She worked at the desk on Commerce Street from 7 in the morning to 9 at night most days, and she did not complain about the hours, not because she had no one to complain to, though she had very few people at that point, but because the hours were not the problem. The hours were the means. Every hour was a brick. By the second year, she had 4 regular clients and a referral network beginning to produce introductions she had not gone looking for. By the third year, she had hired 2 analysts and moved to a proper office. By the 5th year, the firm had 17 employees and a growing track record in turnaround consulting that had started drawing the kind of clients who came with problems complicated enough to require someone who not only understood what the numbers said, but understood what they were concealing. She was building. She did not discuss with her analysts or her clients or the few people in her life who qualified as close that there was a specific destination in view. She let the work be its own explanation, which it was. But in the document on her laptop, which had grown from a short list into a thorough and detailed map over the years, there was a line at the bottom that had been there since the evening she sat at the kitchen table after her father's will was read. It said, Meridian Creative Group. Beside it, for several years, not yet. Then, in the 7th year, worth watching. Then, in the 9th, now, Meridian Creative Group had incorporated 6 months after Vivian's wedding. It was a PR and brand consulting firm. Its founding capital, Nora had pieced together from public records over the years, included a sum that matched, closely enough to be notable, the portion of the inheritance Vivian had received in excess of what Margaret's original will had designated for her. The firm had done well in its early years. Vivian had the social intelligence for it, the ability to sell an idea to a room and to manage other people's brand perception with the same instinctive skill she had always applied to managing her own. The company grew to 20 employees, then 30. It had a client list that included several regional brands and 1 national retail account that gave it credibility beyond its size. And then, in the 7th year of its existence, it had begun to show the particular symptoms that Nora recognized from her turnaround work with the pattern recognition of someone who had spent a decade learning what a company looks like from the inside, when its leadership has outrun its operational structure. Vivian was exceptional at acquiring clients. She was not good at building the systems that held them once the selling was done. Account turnover was too high. Billing rates for retained clients were too low. 3 senior account managers had left in a single calendar year, taking institutional knowledge and client relationships with them. The cost structure had grown at a rate the revenue had not matched, and the gap between them had been narrowing the margin to a thread. Nora had watched the trajectory with the patience of someone who is not in a hurry because the destination is real and the road is clear, and hurrying would only risk arriving before the conditions were right. The conditions became right in the spring of Meridian's 11th year. Gregory Walsh, brought in as CFO 18 months earlier by a board that had finally understood the scale of the problem, had concluded that outside capital was the only viable path to stabilization and had begun making discreet inquiries among firms with turnaround experience. A colleague of Nora's passed along the inquiry with a note saying it might be in her wheelhouse, that the numbers were distressed, but the underlying client relationships had real value. She did not tell her colleague she already knew the company intimately. She reviewed the financials over a weekend. She made a call to Gregory Walsh on Monday morning. She made an offer 3 weeks later. The offer was accepted 4 months after that. On the morning she signed the final papers, she wore the watch she had bought at a clearance counter 10 years ago because she had needed to know what time it was in the new life. She did not wear it as a symbol. She wore it because it told time accurately, and the clasp still worked, and it had been on her wrist long enough that most days she stopped noticing it. But that morning, in the conference room with Patricia Ellison's documents and Gregory Walsh's tired face across the table, she noticed it. She turned it once on her wrist, a small habit she had developed years before. She thought about the woman who had bought it in November a decade ago, standing at the clearance counter with $840 to her name and the specific knowledge of how she had come to be standing there. She thought about the things built since then. The narrow desk on Commerce Street, the 2 pens and the legal pad, the 34 employees who had started as 2, the decade of work. She signed her name on the line and meant it. In the parking structure afterward, sitting in her car before she started the engine, she did not feel the thing that people might have expected, the loud and satisfying warmth of revenge accomplished. She felt something quieter, a settlement, the particular sensation of a long account being closed correctly, not in the spirit of cruelty returned for cruelty, but in the spirit of things finding the balance they were always going to find, given enough time and enough work and enough refusal to stop. She started the engine. She had things to do. There were always things to do, which was one of the gifts of having built something real, that the next thing was always waiting. But first, there was something that was not on any document and not on any list. Something she had been carrying for 10 years alongside the work, in the part of herself where she kept the things that were not about the building. She turned right at the second intersection, away from her office. She drove 12 blocks through the November City to a diner on the corner of Caldwell and Morrison called the Larkspur, a narrow place with red vinyl booths and a coffee machine that had been the same model since the mid-90s. She had been coming here for 9 years, since the apartment on Caldwell Street, first by proximity, and then by habit, and then by the specific attachment that forms to places that have held you during the hard parts. The owner was a woman named Greta, 63 years old, who had been running the Larkspur for 22 years, and who made coffee the way someone makes something they genuinely care about, which produces a result that is different from coffee made by someone going through the motions. Nora took her regular booth in the back corner, the one by the window that looked out onto Morrison Street. She ordered coffee and a piece of rye toast. She sat with her hands around the mug and the November Street, moving past the glass and the quiet of the Larkspur on a Tuesday morning when the breakfast rush had cleared and the lunch crowd had not yet arrived. She had been sitting for approximately 15 minutes when the door opened and an older man came in slowly, with the care of someone managing something that made quick movement inadvisable. He was perhaps 75, gray-haired, in a coat that was clearly good quality but very old, the variety of quality that is not about display but about having bought something once that was worth buying and kept it properly. He came to the counter and asked Greta for a table. Greta, who was in the middle of a phone call she was managing with the receiver wedged between her shoulder and her ear while she restocked the napkin holders, waved generally toward the open section of the diner. The man looked at the available seats. All the booths in the open section were 2-person booths except the large corner table, which held 3 people in what appeared to be a work meeting. The counter had 2 stools with bags on them. The third stool sat directly beneath the drip from an air conditioning unit that had been leaking since August and that Greta had been meaning to address. The man looked at the stool. He looked at the section. He stood very still with his hat in both hands, the particular stillness of someone who does not want to become a problem and is calculating quietly whether there is a solution that does not require asking. Nora watched this. She watched him take half a step toward the leaking stool and stop. She watched him consider the occupied corner table. He was 75 years old, and he needed a place to sit, and the available ones were either wet or occupied. She lifted her hand. He looked over. She gestured at the seat across from her. "There's room," she said. He looked at her with the careful assessment of someone who has lived long enough to understand that invitations from strangers come in different kinds. A moment of consideration, And then he nodded and crossed the diner and sat down. "Thank you," he said. "I did not want to crowd anyone." "You're not crowding," she said. "I have some experience with being pushed out of seats. I would rather not participate in it." She said it lightly, with the specific dryness of someone who has found, after a long time, that the hardest things can be named without weight. He looked at her for a moment across the table with a quality of attention that was more direct than the situation called for, a specific kind of seeing that she recognized as the mark of someone who had spent years in rooms that required it. Greta appeared with the coffee pot. "For you too, Martin?" she said to the man, and he said yes. "Thank you, Greta," and she poured and left. Nora understood from the exchange that he was a regular, which explained the easy familiarity and also why Greta had waved him toward the section without noticing the problem with the available seats. His name was Martin. He had a wide gold ring on his right hand with an insignia she could not read at the angle it faced. His coat on the rack beside the booth was the kind of worn-in quality you saw on things that had been very well made and very well kept. His hands on the coffee mug were steady with the steadiness of someone accustomed to being patient. He asked her, simply and without preamble, whether she had come in for the quiet or for the toast, because in his experience the Larkspur at this hour was primarily one or the other. She told him the truth. She said she had signed a document this morning that had been 10 years in the making, and she was not entirely certain yet what came next, and the Larkspur was the place she had always come to when she was working that out. Martin looked at her. He said that sounded like something worth sitting with. He did not ask what the document was. He did not offer advice. He said it sounded like something worth sitting with, and then he picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the November street. Outside on Morrison Street, a city bus moved past, and a woman walked by with a stroller, and the November light came down at its low late-autumn angle across the wet pavement. Nora wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the street and sat with the 10 years of it, the whole accumulated weight and texture of what she had built and what it had cost her to build it and where she had started. She did not yet know who Martin was. She knew his name and his coffee order, and that Greta knew him, and that he had the quality of a person who had spent time in rooms where things were decided. She knew that he had looked at her with a directness that was rare in a person you had just met. She also knew, though she could not have said why she was certain of it, that this was not the last time she would sit across from him in this booth. Outside, November continued. The light moved across the window in the slow way of late autumn light, taking its time, as though it understood that what was happening in the booth in the back corner of the Larkspur on a Tuesday morning in November was not finished yet, that it was, in fact, only just beginning. She came back to the Larkspur on Friday of that same week, 3 days after the acquisition closed. She had not planned to. She had a full schedule, a transition call with the Meridian senior team at 9, a review session with her own analysts at noon, and an afternoon of documentation that was not going to address itself. She had every practical reason to go directly to the office from the parking garage and no particular reason to turn right instead of left at the second intersection. She turned right. Greta was behind the counter when she came in, and the morning was at the specific quiet hour when the breakfast crowd had thinned and the late-arriving regulars were just starting to appear. Nora went to her booth in the back corner. She ordered coffee and the rye toast she had not actually finished on Tuesday, and she opened her laptop and pulled up the preliminary transition notes. She had been sitting for perhaps 8 minutes when the door opened and Martin came in. He saw her before he reached the counter, and he raised a hand in the same unhurried way she had raised hers at him on Tuesday, the gesture of someone acknowledging a fact rather than performing friendliness. He said something brief to Greta, and then he crossed the diner and stood at the edge of the booth. 2 days in a row is unusual for me, he said. 3 times in a week would be unprecedented. She moved her laptop to make room on the table. He sat down. They did not talk about anything important at first. That was something she noticed about Martin in the weeks that followed. The way he never began in the middle of a thing, always at the edges, always with the small and ordinary matter of the day before it opened into anything larger. He asked her about the coffee, whether Greta had changed the blend. She said she didn't think so. He said it tasted slightly different to him, but that he was probably wrong, that his sense of things had been calibrated by his wife for 40 years and was not entirely trustworthy on its own. He said it without self-pity, in the matter-of-fact way of someone reporting an accurate observation about themselves. She asked him when his wife had died. He said 4 years ago in February, After a winter that had been difficult in ways that February winters sometimes were, when you were managing something, and the cold had a way of making everything harder than it needed to be. He said her name was Helen, and that she had been a much better judge of coffee and of most other things than he was, and that he was still in the process of adjusting his estimates accordingly. Nora looked at the window. She said she understood the recalibration. She did not explain what she meant by that, and he did not ask. She came back on Monday. He was already there. By the third week of November, it had become the thing it became without either of them having proposed that it become anything, which was a standing arrangement that neither of them spoke about directly, because speaking about it would have required an acknowledgement that might have changed the texture of it. She arrived between 8 and 8:30. He was usually there first. If he was not, he arrived within 20 minutes. Greta brought 2 coffees without being asked. They talked the way 2 people talk when neither of them has anything to prove and both of them have enough history to know the difference between a conversation that is going somewhere and one that is. Martin had been in finance most of his life. She gathered, though he described it with the specific vagueness of someone who has decided that their professional identity is the least interesting thing about them and does not intend to let it lead the conversation. He said he had run a firm for a long time and had stepped back from it, and that the stepping back had been the right decision and also one of the stranger experiences of his life, to have organized your days around a thing for 4 decades, and then to be asked by your own choice to organize them around something else. What did you organize them around instead? She asked. He thought about it for a moment with the real consideration he gave everything she asked him. He said he had been trying to understand which parts of the work had been the work and which parts had been the structure around the work, and that the distinction turned out to be harder to see when you were inside it every day than when you stepped back. He said he came to the Larkspur because it was a place where no one needed him to be anything specific, which was a rarer thing than it sounded. She understood that completely. She told him so. He asked about her work without pressing for details, in the open way of someone who is genuinely interested but understands that interest is not the same as a claim. She told him about Callahan Financial Consulting and the general shape of it, the turnaround work, the specific satisfaction of understanding a distressed company's numbers well enough to see what they were hiding and then doing something useful with what you found. She told him about starting it from a narrow desk on Commerce Street with 2 pens and a legal pad. She told him about the first year, the restaurant owner and the nonprofit and the forensic accounting project, not as a sequence of hardships, but as a sequence of problems she had found genuinely interesting, which was how she had always experienced them. He listened the way she had stopped expecting most people to listen, fully and without preparing his response while she was still talking. When she finished, he asked one specific follow-up question about the forensic project, something about whether the discrepancy she had found had been intentional or structural, and the question was good enough that she spent 10 minutes answering it. And by the time she looked up it was 9:15, and she had missed the start of the transition call by 15 minutes. She gathered her things. She said she had to go. He said of course. She put on her coat and picked up her bag and walked toward the door and then stopped. She turned back. She was not sure why she said what she said next, except that there was something in the quality of the morning, the specific November light through the Larkspur window and the coffee that tasted the same as it always had and the unhurried attention he had been giving her for 20 minutes, that made the saying of it feel possible in a way it had not felt in a long time. She said, I acquired a company this week that belonged to my sister. We have not spoken in 10 years. She took the man I was going to marry and the inheritance I was going to receive and used one to start the other. I built what I built in response to that, and now I own her company, and I am not sure yet what that means about who I am. She said it to the middle distance between herself and the booth rather than to him directly. The way you say the true thing when you are not entirely sure you meant to say it. Martin held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. He said, it means you built something real. Whether or not it was built in response to something. The response doesn't disqualify the building. She held that for a moment. Then she nodded once and went to the door and out into the November morning. She was 6 minutes late to the transition call. She dialed in from the parking garage stairwell with her coat still on and her laptop balanced on the railing, and she was entirely present for every minute of it, which was how she operated. The transition call with the Meridian team lasted 2 hours. There were 14 people on the line, ranging from the 2 remaining senior account managers to the junior coordinators who had been there less than a year and whose faces she had not yet learned. She introduced herself simply. She said she was Nora Callahan of Callahan Financial Consulting and that her firm had acquired Meridian Creative Group and that her intention over the next 30 days was to listen before she acted, because she had found over the years that the most expensive mistakes in a transition came from acting on assumptions rather than information. She said she would be meeting with each team in person over the following 2 weeks. She said she was not there to dismantle anything. She was there to understand what was worth keeping and to build on it correctly. There was a silence on the line when she finished that had the specific quality of people who have been bracing for bad news and are not yet certain whether they have received it. Then one of the senior account managers, a woman named Tessa who had been with the company for 6 years and had the careful tone of someone who has learned to be measured in rooms she does not fully control, asked whether any positions were expected to be eliminated. Nora said that no decisions had been made and that the 30-day listening period was not a formality. She said positions would be evaluated on the basis of what the company actually needed operationally, and that the process would be transparent and direct. She said she did not believe in managing people through ambiguity. Another silence. Then Tessa said, "Thank you," and someone else on the call said the same, and the meeting moved into logistics. Afterward, alone in her office, Nora sat with her transition notes spread across the desk and thought about the 14 people whose livelihoods were now her responsibility. She thought about this the way she thought about all real responsibilities, not as a weight to be managed, but as a fact to be respected. They had come to work for a company that had been failing around them without their having caused the failure. That was not nothing. That was the thing she had to hold correctly. She also thought about Vivian, specifically about the fact that Vivian did not yet know. Gregory Walsh had been managing the communications through the acquisition process, which meant that the formal notification to Vivian Callahan Marsh, as the former sole owner and CEO of Meridian Creative Group, had gone through Patricia Ellison's office on the day the papers were signed. It would have landed in Vivian's inbox by late Tuesday afternoon. That was 4 days ago. Nora had not heard from her. She had expected this, had expected either a silence or an immediate eruption, and was in some ways more prepared for the eruption. The silence felt like something gathering. It gathered for 2 more days. Then on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the acquisition, while Nora was at her desk reviewing the Meridian client file for the 3rd time that week, her assistant Marcus knocked on the open door and said there was a woman in the lobby who did not have an appointment and who had given her name as Vivian Marsh. Nora set down the file. She asked Marcus to show her in. Vivian Callahan Marsh was 44 years old and looked, at first glance, very much as she had always looked, which was the kind of attractive that comes from years of understanding exactly how to present oneself and deploying that understanding consistently. Her hair was the same warm brown it had always been, though Nora knew from simple arithmetic that it was maintained rather than natural now. She wore a coat that was clearly expensive and clearly chosen for the impression it made, and she carried herself with the particular composure of a woman who had spent 11 years building a company and who had not yet fully metabolized the fact that the company was gone. She came in and stood in front of Nora's desk, and she did not sit down, which Nora understood as a choice rather than an oversight. "I want you to know," Vivian said, "that I know what you did." Nora looked at her across the desk. She did not say anything. "I want you to know that I know this was not a business decision." Vivian's voice was steady and had the quality of something that had been prepared in advance and was being delivered with precision. "You targeted my company specifically. You spent years waiting for the right moment, and then you moved when I was most vulnerable. That is not what you want people to think it is." Nora said, "What do I want people to think it is?" "A legitimate acquisition." She said it with a flatness that was meant to convey contempt. "It is a legitimate acquisition." Nora said it without heat or emphasis. "I have the documentation to demonstrate that from the first approach through the final papers, every decision was made on sound financial grounds. Gregory Walsh will confirm that. Patricia Ellison will confirm it. The board of Meridian will confirm it. The numbers confirm it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression that was not contempt, something that lived under the contempt and that Nora recognized, because she had felt its cousin in herself a long time ago. It was the specific look of someone confronting the full weight of a consequence they had known was coming on some level and had spent years persuading themselves was not. "You always had to win," Vivian said. "Even at the beginning. You always had to be the responsible one, the one who did everything right. Nora looked at her sister. She looked at her the way she had learned over 10 years of building something real to look at a situation, which was directly and without the distortion of what she wanted to be true about it. I didn't take your wedding, she said. I didn't take your fiancé. I didn't redirect an inheritance that our mother designated for both of us. Those were your choices, Vivian. I built my response to them. That's the whole story. Vivian's composure held, but it held visibly, the way a thing holds when the holding requires active effort. She said, Daniel and I divorced 2 years ago, if you wanted to know. Nora said, I didn't. A silence that had weight in it. Outside the office window, the city moved through its Thursday morning. The construction crane 3 blocks east turning against the gray sky. A bus going past on Commerce Street. The ordinary machinery of things being built and maintained. Vivian said, So what happens now? To the company. To the people who work there. Nora picked up the Meridian client file from her desk and set it in front of her. She said, I'm going to run it properly. I'm going to stabilize the client relationships and fix the operational structure and make sure the 28 people who work there still have jobs worth having in 6 months. That's what happens now. Vivian looked at the file. Then she looked at Nora. Something in her face shifted in a direction Nora could not read clearly, not softening exactly, not apology, but something that was perhaps the first honest expression she had seen from her sister in 10 years, stripped of performance and calculation and the specific kind of beauty that had always been partly armor. I built that company, Vivian said. Whatever you think of how I did it. I built it. I know you did, Nora said. She said it plainly, without irony, because it was true and she had never not known it was true. You built it. And then you ran it in a way that was going to destroy it. I'm going to keep it from being destroyed. That's all this is. Vivian stood with her coat on in the middle of Nora's office for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked out without saying anything else, and the door closed behind her with the sound of a door closing, which is all some endings are. Nora sat at her desk for a while after that. She did not feel what she had imagined she would feel when this moment finally came, back in the years when she had allowed herself to imagine it at all. The satisfaction she had expected was there, but it was smaller and quieter than she had built it to be in her mind. More like the satisfaction of a structural problem correctly solved than the satisfaction of a wound avenged. The wound was its own thing, separate. The building had been the building. The two had always been connected, but they were not the same thing. And now that she was standing at the end of both of them, she could see the distinction more clearly than she ever had before. She opened the Meridian client file. She got back to work. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She was at the Larkspur the following Tuesday morning. Martin was already in the booth, his coffee in front of him, the newspaper open to the business section, which he closed when she sat down with the particular movement of someone who has finished with what he was reading regardless of whether he had finished. She had been thinking since Thursday about what to tell him, or whether to tell him anything, about Vivian and the conversation in her office. She had found over the weeks of their Tuesday mornings that she told Martin things she did not tell other people, not because she was careless, but because his manner created a specific kind of permission, the permission that comes from someone who listens without requiring you to be anything in particular, who receives what you say without rearranging it into a lesson or a solution. She had not had that kind of listener in a long time. She had, in some ways, never had it. She told him about Vivian's visit. She told it in the specific way she told things, from the beginning and without skipping, including the part about what Vivian had built, because she had always believed that accurate accounting required you to include the things that complicated the picture. Martin listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, She came. Yes. You didn't expect her to. I expected she would eventually. Not in person. He turned the coffee cup once in his hands, a habit she had begun to recognize as his version of thinking something through. He said, She came in person because she needed to see whether you had become someone she didn't recognize. Nora looked at him. He said, People who have done a significant wrong to someone they know need to believe one of two things. Either that the person they wronged is still suffering, which confirms that the wrong was powerful, or that the person has become something hard and cold in response to it, which confirms that the wrong was justified. He paused. When they find neither of those things, it's a more complicated encounter. Nora sat with that for a while. She looked at the November street through the window and the people passing on the sidewalk with their collars up against the cold. She thought about Vivian's face when she had said, "I didn't take your wedding. I didn't take your fiancé." The specific expression under the composure that had been neither anger nor grief, but something adjacent to both. She said, "She told me she and Daniel divorced 2 years ago." Martin did not ask who Daniel was. He had gathered enough from the earlier conversation. He said only, "That must have been its own kind of information." "It didn't change anything," Nora said. "No," Martin said, "but it changes the shape of the picture." She had not thought about it quite that way. She thought about it now, turning it over. She thought about Vivian at 44, in the coat that had been chosen for the impression it made, standing in the office of the company she had built and lost without saying anything after Nora told her the truth. She thought about 11 years of a marriage that had started from a theft and what those years must have looked like from the inside, and whether Vivian had, in some part of herself that she would never say aloud, understood precisely what she had built her life on and what that meant over time. She did not feel sorry for Vivian, but she felt something that was not quite the absence of pity either, something that existed in the narrow space between the two, the specific and uncomfortable recognition that the people who wrong you are not simplified by the wrong, that they continue to be full and complicated people having full and complicated lives, and that this does not change what they did, but it does change the texture of having to live in a world that contains them. She said, "I always had to win." Martin looked at her steadily. Did she say that as an accusation? She said it like she believed it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Winning and building are not the same thing. People who are genuinely building something tend not to think of themselves as winning. They tend to think of themselves as working." She looked at him across the table. He held the coffee cup in both hands with the patient ease of a man who had sat in enough important rooms to know that silence was not something to fill. She said, "You're very good at saying the right thing." He said, "I've had a long time to get better at it. I was not good at it for most of the years when it mattered most." He said it without self-dramatization. In the factual way, he said things about himself that cost him something to say. She asked him once, on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, what kind of firm he had run. She asked it in the casual way of someone asking after a detail rather than the whole, and he answered in the same register. He said it had been a private investment firm. He said they had focused on regional businesses at inflection points, companies that were either growing fast enough to need structural capital or stable enough to need patient capital, and that his particular interest had been in the distinction between those two states because the diagnosis determined everything that came after. She said that sounded like turnaround work from the other side of the table. He said it was, in a way. He said the thing he had found over decades in that work was that most companies in difficulty were not in difficulty because of what they thought they were in difficulty about. The presenting problem was almost never the root. The root was usually structural and usually older than the crisis and usually visible, in retrospect, in things the numbers had been saying for years before anyone paid attention to them. She said, "That's exactly what I found with Meridian. The operational problems were 5 years old. The crisis was 1 year old. Everyone involved had spent 4 years treating the symptoms." He looked at her with the specific quality of attention she had come to associate with the moments when he had found something genuinely interesting. He said, "What was the root?" She told him. She talked for 20 minutes about the Meridian client file, about the account turnover patterns, and the billing structure, and the talent attrition, and the way the three problems fed each other in a loop that was self-reinforcing once it got started. She talked about what she planned to do with it, the restructured retainer agreements, and the compensation adjustments, and the operational manual that did not exist and needed to. She talked about Tessa, the senior account manager who had been holding 3 of the major client relationships together through competence and personal loyalty, and who was not yet being paid what someone holding 3 major client relationships together was worth. Martin listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he did not offer advice. He asked one question about the retainer restructuring, and the question was sharp enough that she spent 10 minutes answering it and arrived at a conclusion about the pricing model that she had not been fully confident in before and was now. This was how their mornings went. He did not tell her what to do. He asked questions that were better than most advice. In the 3rd week of December, he told her about his daughter. Her name was Claire, and she lived in Boston and worked in oncology research at a teaching hospital and called every Sunday at 7 in the evening, which was the call Martin organized his Sundays around in the way of someone who has learned the hard way which commitments deserve to become the structure of your week. He said Claire had her mother's way of cutting to the thing that mattered without preamble, which was a quality he had always admired in Helen, and that he admired equally in Claire, and that he had spent many years being the person in the room who needed to be cut to before he understood that patience was not the same as depth. Nora asked him what he meant. He said he had spent most of his working life being good at problems that could be solved with information and effort. He said those were the problems his mind found naturally engaging, and that he had organized a great deal of his life around them. He said the problems that could not be solved with information and effort, the ones that required something different, something he did not have good language for, those he had not been good at. He said he had been slow to see people who were struggling when the struggling was not visible on the surface. He said this was the thing Helen had been better at than almost anyone he had ever known, and that it was also the thing Claire had, and that sitting across from someone in a diner and being genuinely present with them without needing to solve anything was still, at 76, something he was practicing. Nora looked at her coffee cup. She said, "My father was the same way. He was good at the problems that had answers." Martin said, "Most of us are. The other problems are harder to love." She asked him once what his last name was. It was a Tuesday morning in early January, their 7th or 8th week of the Larkspur mornings, and she asked it in the way you ask someone whose first name you have been using for 2 months and whose last name has simply never come up, which is without particular weight, because it is just a detail you have been getting along fine without. He said it was Hargrove. Martin Hargrove. She turned the name over. There was something about it that had the weight of a name she had heard before, but she could not place it immediately, the way you cannot always place a piece of music the first time you hear its title without the melody. She filed it in the way she filed things, which was carefully and without rushing the connection. She was 3 blocks from the Larkspur and heading toward her office when it arrived. She was walking with her collar up against the January cold and her bag over one shoulder and her mind already moving through the day's schedule when the name arranged itself against the correct background. Hargrove Capital Partners. She had read the name in a deal report 8 months ago, a regional business publication that covered investment activity in the private sector. Hargrove Capital had been among the firms that had evaluated Meridian Creative Group as an acquisition target 18 months before Nora's approach. They had passed. She stopped on the sidewalk. A man behind her said, "Excuse me," and moved around her, and she stepped to the side of the pavement and stood there in the January cold and thought about this. Hargrove Capital Partners, a private investment firm with 40 years of operation, founded and run by a man named Martin Hargrove, who had stepped back from active management 4 years ago. She knew the firm's name from deal reports and industry coverage. She had read a profile of it once in a regional finance magazine, something about its 40-year track record and its particular focus on community-anchored businesses. She had not retained a physical description of the founder. She had retained the name. The man who had been drinking coffee with her every Tuesday morning for 2 months. The man who asked questions that were sharper than advice. The man who had told her that winning and building were not the same thing, was Martin Hargrove. The Martin Hargrove. He had looked at Meridian Creative Group and passed, for exactly the reasons she had spent 10 years waiting to address. And he had no idea she knew this, because she had not known it herself until 30 seconds ago on a January sidewalk 3 blocks from a diner where Greta brought 2 coffees without being asked. She stood on the pavement for a while longer. She thought about what this meant. She thought about whether it changed anything. She thought about the specifics of it, the way he had listened when she described the Meridian operational problems, the quality of attention he had given her analysis of the retainer structure, the question about the pricing model that had been better than most advice. She thought about whether he had known who she was from the beginning. She thought about that last part for a long time. She went to the office. She sat at her desk, and she opened the deal report from 8 months ago and found the paragraph about Hargrove Capital's evaluation of Meridian Creative Group. She read it again. The language was brief and standard, the kind of language that appears in deal reports about transactions that did not happen. She read it for what was between the lines, which was that a firm with 40 years of experience and a strong track record of accurate evaluation had looked at Meridian's numbers and the specific patterns within them, and had concluded that the company's operational dysfunction was deeper than its leadership had acknowledged or was capable of addressing. That was what a pass meant at that level. Not that the asset lacked value. That the path to value required something the current structure could not provide. She had read it correctly, in other words. And so had he. She closed the report. She sat at her desk for a few minutes with the specific quality of thought that comes when a picture you have been looking at for a long time rearranges itself into a different and more complete image. The same elements, differently ordered. The same facts, clarified by the new arrangement. She thought about the morning she had lifted her hand across the diner and said there's room. She thought about the cold and the leaking stool and the man standing at the counter with his hat in both hands, calculating quietly. She thought about what she had said, that she had some experience with being pushed out of seats and would rather not participate in it. She had said it as the kind of thing you say when the hard years have left you with a dry enough relationship to them that you can name them in passing. She thought about what Martin had made of that, if he had heard it the way she meant it. She thought about his face when she had told him about the acquisition. Not a business decision, she had said. And he had said, the response doesn't disqualify the building. He had said it as if he had thought about this kind of thing before, as if the distinction between building from pain and building from purpose was one he had some reason to know. She opened a new document. She sat with it for a moment, and then she began to write. She did not change her routine. She did not bring up Hargrove Capital the following Tuesday morning. She came in at her regular time, and he was there, and Greta brought 2 coffees, and the morning had the same quality it always had, the same unhurried warmth of 2 people who had found each other's company useful in the way that mattered most, which was not useful for anything in particular, but useful in the general sense of making the days more accurately themselves. She was, however, paying a different kind of attention now. She was paying the attention of someone who has a new piece of information and is watching to see how it connects to the existing picture. She noticed things she had noticed before but not assembled. The specific quality of the questions he asked about her work, which were not the questions of a retired investor with general curiosity, but the questions of someone who understood deal structure and operational analysis at the level of someone who had been doing it for 40 years. The way he responded to her description of the Meridian retainer problem, a slight forward adjustment in his posture that she had registered as engagement and that now read also as recognition. The comment he had made weeks ago about companies in difficulty usually having structural problems older than their crises, which was not a casual observation but a hard-earned professional conviction. She also noticed his restraint. He had not once mentioned Hargrove Capital, not once suggested that he knew the Meridian name from the evaluation 18 months ago, not once positioned himself as a resource or a connection or anything beyond a man who came to the Larkspur in the mornings and drank coffee and asked good questions. He had been, in every way, exactly what he presented himself as in this specific space, which was a person who needed the same thing she needed, which was a place where nobody required them to be anything particular. She had been doing the same thing, she understood. She had been exactly what she presented herself as in this space, which was a person working through a very long thing and not yet entirely done working through it. She had not mentioned Callahan Financial Consulting by name in the context of any industry recognition. She had not mentioned Hargrove Capital. She had not positioned herself as someone whose work he might have heard of or whose company's name might appear in the same deal reports as his. They had been giving each other, without having agreed to, the specific courtesy of anonymity, the rare and deliberate experience of being known only as yourself, without the professional biography attached. She understood this now with the specific clarity of someone who has been given something without being told they are being given it, and who has recognized the gift only when it was nearly over. On a Friday morning in the 3rd week of January, Martin came in later than usual and sat down with the specific manner of someone who had been somewhere before the diner and was still carrying the weight of it. He ordered his coffee and he looked at the window and did not immediately begin the conversation in his usual way, from the edges inward. She waited. She had learned his rhythms well enough to know that some mornings required a different kind of patience than others. After a while he said, "I had a call this morning from someone on my former firm's board." He said it with the slightly different tone of a man stepping briefly out of the space they had built here and back into the other life, the one with the name attached to it. She looked at him. She waited. He said, "There have been some conversations among former clients and business partners about a community investment fund." an effort to pool private capital for regional businesses in exactly the kinds of neighborhoods where conventional investment has been pulling back. He said it the way he said most things, as information, without inflection designed to elicit any particular response. She said, "That sounds like work worth doing." He looked at her. He said, "It is." He paused. "The question is who runs it." She held his gaze. She said, carefully, "That's always the question." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He said, "I keep thinking about a conversation I had in this booth in November. A woman who said she had signed a document that was 10 years in the making and was not sure yet what came next. She said, I remember that conversation." He said, "She knew what came next. She just had not finished deciding whether to trust herself that she did." She sat with that for a long moment. The Larkspur was quiet around them. Greta was doing something behind the counter that involved a great deal of focused attention and a butter knife. On Morrison Street, the January morning moved through its usual business, a city bus, two people with coffee cups walking fast, a man in a delivery uniform checking his phone. She said, "Martin." She said it with the specific weight of a first name that contains a question. He looked at her. She said, "Your firm evaluated Meridian Creative Group 18 months ago. You passed." He was quiet for a moment. Not with surprise exactly, or not only with surprise. With the look of a person who had been waiting, perhaps, for the specific shape of this moment, and who was receiving it now. He said, "Yes, we did." She said, "You knew the company name from the beginning." When I described the acquisition in November, he said, "I recognized the name." "Yes," she said, "but you didn't say so." He looked at the table. He said, "You came in here on a Tuesday morning, and you sat down with a document you had been working toward for 10 years, and you were working out what it meant." He said it evenly, choosing each word with the same care she had come to expect from him. "I was not going to interrupt that with a deal report." She looked at him. She said, "Did you know who I was?" He said, "I knew your firm's name from the acquisition coverage in the regional press." "Yes." He paused. "I did not know your full story until you told it to me. And you told it to me because you chose to, not because I asked you to." She sat with this. She sat with the full assembled shape of it, the Tuesday in November, and the leaking stool and the hand lifted across the diner. The weeks of mornings, and the coffee that tasted the same, and the questions that were better than advice. The restraint on both sides. The specific and mutual courtesy of two people giving each other the room to be exactly what they were without the professional biography making it complicated. She said, "What did you make of it? Knowing what you knew about the company, and then hearing my version of where it started." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I made the same thing of it I made the first morning. That you are someone who builds things because they are worth building and not primarily because of what the building proves about you." He said it plainly, without the performance of a compliment. In the same register he used for accurate observations about operational structure. She said, "That's a generous reading." He said, "It's an accurate one. The distinction between a vindictive acquisition and a sound one is visible in the work. I've been watching the work for 2 months. Those two things are not the same." She looked at her coffee cup. She turned it once in her hands. She said, "The Community Investment Fund. Tell me about the structure." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted in the direction of what she had seen in him on the best of their Tuesday mornings. The specific quality of someone who has arrived at the part of the conversation that was the whole point of the conversation and who intends to be entirely present for it. He told her. He talked for 30 minutes about the fund, about its intended scope and its target communities and the gap it was designed to address, the specific absence of patient capital at the scale of small to mid-sized regional businesses, the kind too large for microfinance and too small and too rooted to attract conventional private equity that needed a return horizon shorter than a community's transformation timeline. He talked about what the structure needed to work, which was someone with operational credibility, someone who understood distressed business analysis from the inside, someone the communities themselves would trust because that person had built something real and had done it in a way that was visible. He did not say her name. He did not say you. He described the role with the care of someone laying out a set of precise requirements that the person across the table could assess for themselves. When he finished, the Larkspur was warming up around them, the late morning filling in with the people who came after the breakfast rush, a couple at the front booth, a woman with a laptop at the counter, Greta refilling the display case with the focused satisfaction of someone whose work was in order. Nora sat with everything he had said. She thought about the things to build document on her laptop, the one she had started on a kitchen table the evening her father's will was read. She thought about what she had written at the bottom of it in November, after the acquisition closed, in the line she had added below Meridian Creative Group. She had written, "What's next?" Just that, without an answer yet. She thought about the narrow desk on Commerce Street, and the 2 pens, and the legal pad, and the 34 employees who had started as a single desk. She thought about the 14 people on the Meridian transition call who had been holding together something that was failing around them and who deserved to have someone run it correctly. She thought about a Tuesday morning in November when she had come into a diner because she needed to work out what something meant, and a man had stood at the counter with his hat in both hands and nowhere good to sit, and she had lifted her hand. She looked at Martin across the table. She said, "I need 30 days to stabilize the Meridian transition properly before I can commit time to anything else. The retainer restructuring needs to be complete, and Tessa needs to be in the right role before the company can run without my daily attention." Martin said, "Of course." She said, "After 30 days, I would like to have a proper conversation. With documentation. A full structural proposal, not a booth conversation." Martin said, "I can have something drafted by the end of the month." She said, "So can I." He looked at her. The same direct quality of attention that had been there the first morning, the kind of seeing she had recognized then without being able to name it, and that she could name now, which was the attention of someone who understood that the thing in front of him was worth the full quality of his presence and was giving it accordingly. He said, "I want to say something." He said it in the slightly different register he used when the thing being said was not casual. She waited. He said, "I came to this diner for 4 years after Helen died. Every Tuesday and most Fridays. Greta knows my order. There have been maybe a dozen conversations in that time that were worth having." He paused. "Since November, there have been many more than that." She said, "For me too." He said, "I am aware that there is a version of this conversation that sounds like a transaction. A wealthy former investor meets a woman who built something real and they find common purpose." He said it with the clarity of someone who has thought carefully about how a thing could be misread and wants to address it before it is misread. "What I want you to know is that the fund conversation is real and the structural fit is real and the financial logic stands entirely on its own. And I also want you to know that none of that is why I came back on Friday in November after you told me you had signed a document 10 years in the making." He stopped. "The reason I came back on Friday has nothing to do with Meridian or Callahan Financial Consulting or the Community Investment Fund. It is because you told the truth in this booth in a way that most people do not tell it, and because I recognized the shape of someone who had been through something real and had not let it make them less than they were." Nora looked at the window. She looked at the January street and the ordinary morning moving through it. She thought about 10 years of early mornings and late nights and the desk on Commerce Street and the document on her laptop, and the things she had built and the things she had held onto through the building, the things that had not been about the building at all, the things that were simply about remaining, in the face of all of it, the person she had decided to be. She said, "My father had a way of asking, 'What did you notice today?' Not 'How was your day?' but 'What did you notice?'" She said it quietly, looking at the street. "I have been thinking about what I noticed in November." She paused. "I noticed a man standing at a counter with nowhere good to sit, and I invited him to sit down because I knew what it felt like to not have a seat at the table you were supposed to be at." Martin said nothing. He held his coffee. She said, "I did not do it because I expected anything. I did not know who you were. I did not know anything except that the stool was leaking and the corner table was full, and you looked like someone who had been somewhere important before he came here and who needed, for the moment, just the coffee and the quiet." She turned from the window and looked at him. She said, "I think that is still what this is. The coffee and the quiet. And also perhaps the next thing." Martin looked at her for a long moment. Then he did what she had seen him do before on the mornings when something had been said that he intended to carry carefully. He looked at the table and turned his coffee cup once in his hands and was very still. He said, "I think you're right." Outside on Morrison Street, the January light came through the Larkspur window at the low angle of a winter morning, flat and clear and without warmth, but with a quality of visibility that summer light lacked, the quality of being able to see things exactly as they were. The coffee machine behind the counter made its sound. Greta was saying something to the couple at the front booth. The city moved past the glass in its January business, patient and continuous. Nora picked up her cup. She said, "Tell me about the communities the fund is designed to serve." Martin set down his cup and told her. The 30 days she had asked for were 30 of the most concentrated days of her working life. And she had worked some concentrated days. The Meridian transition required the kind of sustained attention that left no room for anything else from 7 in the morning until 9 at night. And she gave it that attention without complaint because the work required it, and because the 28 people whose livelihoods depended on whether she did it correctly deserved someone who showed up with everything she had. She met with each team individually. She sat with the account managers and the coordinators and the creative staff, and she listened in the way Martin had taught her, without preparing her response while the other person was still talking, with the full and unhurried reception of someone who understood that what you heard in those meetings was more valuable than anything you could say in them. What she heard was a company that had been well-founded and badly run, not maliciously, not carelessly in the sense of not caring, but carelessly in the sense of a founder who cared enormously about the front-facing work and had never built the infrastructure behind it. The systems and the documentation and the compensation structures and the clear accountabilities that made the difference between a company that could survive the departure of key people and one that could not. She had seen this pattern many times before in her turnaround work. It was not unusual. It was not even uncommon among companies founded by people with genuine talent for the primary work. The talent and the operational discipline were different skills, and they did not always arrive in the same person. She restructured the retainer agreements over the first 2 weeks. She elevated Tessa to Director of Client Services and gave her the authority the title required, not just the name. She hired one new account coordinator through a referral from Tessa, a young woman named Diana, who had the specific quality of someone who had been learning the right things in the wrong environment and would do considerably better in a correct one. She documented the institutional knowledge that had been living in people's heads and in email chains and nowhere else, and she got it into a system that would survive the next departure and the one after that. By the end of the 30 days, the Meridian client retention rate had. Paragraph said only, "I am glad the company is in the right hands. I am glad you built what you built. I always knew you would." Nora sat with the letter for a long time. She sat with it the way she sat with things that required more than a quick pass to understand, with the full, impatient attention she had been practicing for 39 years. She thought about the girl who had put half of every paycheck into a savings account since she was 16. She thought about the dress and the closet bag and the seating chart and the 83 people and the sapphire ring on the right hand. She thought about the studio on Larkin Street and the clearance counter watch and the narrow desk on Commerce Street with the view of the parking structure and the slice of city beyond it. She thought about her father at the kitchen table asking, "What did you notice today?" and about the specific quality of his attention when he was fully present, which had been the best of him and which she had spent 10 years carrying forward in the way you carry the best of someone after they are gone. She thought about Martin in the Larkspur booth with his hat in both hands and nowhere good to sit, and about lifting her hand across the diner, not because she was expecting anything, not because she had calculated what it might return to her, but because the stool was leaking and the corner table was full, and she knew what it felt like to not have a seat at the table you were supposed to be at. She thought about what that single lifted hand had set in motion, the Tuesday mornings and the questions that were better than advice, and the 40 years of operational knowledge, and the fund that was going to do something real in neighborhoods that needed something real done in them. She thought about the fact that none of it would have happened the way it happened if she had done what most people did, which was to look at the man with the hat in both hands and make the small and ordinary calculation that it was not her problem to solve. She folded Vivian's letter and placed it in the drawer of her desk where she kept things worth keeping. Not as evidence, not as a trophy, as part of the record of what had happened, the full record, including the parts that were not simple. She looked at the watch on her wrist. The plain silver watch with the white face that told time without ceremony and that had been on her wrist for 10 years since the clearance counter at the department store, since the beginning of the new life and all the days of the building. She turned it once, the small habit she had carried through 10 years of desks and meetings and early mornings and late nights. She thought about her father's specific question. What did you notice today? She had noticed, 10 years ago on a November Tuesday, a man standing at a counter with his hat in his hands and nowhere good to sit. She had noticed that the stool was leaking and that the corner table was full. She had noticed that he had the bearing of someone who had been somewhere important and who needed, in that moment. Just the coffee and the quiet. She had noticed all of that, and she had lifted her hand. She had not known who he was. She had not been calculating anything. She had simply been a person who knew what it felt like to be pushed out of a seat and who had decided, a long time ago, and for reasons that had nothing to do with reward, not to participate in that when it was in her power to do otherwise. She looked at the window of her office, at the February city moving through its afternoon. The construction craned 3 blocks east, turning against a sky that had the specific pale blue of a winter afternoon that is running out of light. Traffic on Commerce Street. The ordinary machinery of a city at work, building things, maintaining things, replacing things that had stopped working with things that could. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was Martin, which was unusual because they were a booth conversation rather than a phone call kind of partnership. She answered. He said, "I just had a call from the Regional Business Council. They want to feature the fund launch at the Spring Investment Forum." He paused. They asked who would be speaking, and I said both of us. "I hope that was correct." She said, "That was correct." He said, "I also want to tell you something." He used the slightly different register. She waited. He said, "I have been in finance for 43 years. I have evaluated hundreds of businesses, funded dozens of them, watched some of them become extraordinary and some of them fail, sometimes correctly and sometimes not." He paused. "I want you to know that what you built, the turnaround work, the Meridian acquisition, the fund structure, the way you run a room, the way you listen." He stopped. He said, "It is the best work I have encountered in a very long time. I wanted you to know that from me directly rather than hearing it at the launch from someone else." Nora looked at the February sky through her office window. She held the phone and thought about the clearance counter watch and the 2 pins and the legal pad and the 34 employees who had started as 0 and the things built in the decade between that Tuesday morning and this one. She said, "Thank you, Martin." She said it simply, without deflection, because she had learned over a hard 10 years that some things were meant to be received rather than redirected. That accepting a true thing said plainly was its own form of integrity. Her father had taught her that, in the specific way he had of asking what you noticed, of treating the noticing as something worth the time it took to say it clearly. She said, "I'll see you Tuesday." He said, "Tuesday." She set the phone down. She sat for a moment with the February afternoon around her, and the watch on her wrist, and the letter in the drawer, and the city outside the window, and the work that was waiting on the desk, and the work that was waiting beyond that, the fund. Stabilized. 2 clients who had been in the process of quiet disengagement had recommitted. The team meeting on the last Friday of the month had the quality she had been building toward, not the guarded watchfulness of people waiting for the next bad news, but the careful and cautious beginning of people who were starting to believe that the ground beneath them was solid. She came to the Larkspur the following Tuesday with a folder of documents and the specific feeling of someone who has finished one thing and is standing at the beginning of the next. Martin had his own folder. They set them both on the table between the coffee cups, and they worked for 3 hours in the back corner booth, while Greta refilled their cups twice without being asked, and the diner moved through its morning around them. The fund structure was more sophisticated than she had expected, and also more aligned with the work she had been building toward than she had allowed herself to anticipate. It was designed for patient capital, for the kind of investment that accepted a decade's horizon rather than a quarter's, for communities where the conventional return metrics failed to capture what was actually at stake, which was not only the financial performance of individual businesses, but the economic health of the neighborhoods those businesses anchored. Martin had spent 4 years developing the framework after stepping back from Hargrove Capital. It was the work of someone who had learned over a long career what the standard model missed, and who had decided to do something specific about the missing. Her documents covered the operational side, the criteria for business selection, the technical assistance component that she believed was inseparable from the capital component, the community input process that she considered non-negotiable, because she had watched enough interventions fail from the outside to understand that the people whose neighborhoods you were working in had to be in the room where the decisions were made. She had written it the way she wrote everything, from the ground up, with the specifics preceding the framework rather than the other way around. They went through both documents page by page. They disagreed on 3 things and resolved 2 of them inside the hour. The third, which was about the governance structure and specifically about how much decision authority should rest with community representatives versus the fund's investment committee, They set aside with the understanding that it required more than one conversation and that the right answer was not going to come from either of them alone. At the end of 3 hours, they both sat back. The documents were annotated in both their handwriting. The coffee cups were empty. The late morning light came through the Larkspur window at its winter angle across the table. Martin said, "I think we have something." Nora said, "I think we have the beginning of something." Which is the right thing to have at this stage. He looked at her. He said, "You are a precise person." She said, "You could also say careful." He said, "I could." He said it with the specific tone of someone for whom careful was a high compliment and who intended it as one. They formalized the partnership in February. The fund was called Birch Community Capital, and she had chosen the name and he had not questioned it, which was one of the things she appreciated about him, that he understood some things were not his to question. She had chosen it because Birch was the street she had grown up on, the street where the apartment she had raised herself in after the betrayal had been, the street where the laundromat was that she had used on Sunday mornings in the first year on Larkin, and the street her father had driven her down every day to school for 12 years before she knew what streets were called. It was the name of the place she had come from, which was the right name for what she was building, because everything she had built had come from that place too. The first fund close brought in considerably more capital than the initial projections, partly because Martin's network was what it was after 40 years, and partly because Nora's track record at Callahan Financial Consulting had, over 10 years, produced exactly the kind of credibility that speaks in rooms where large decisions are made. She did not say this to Martin. He did not say it to her. They both understood it and let it be part of the foundation without making it the conversation. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, 3 months after the acquisition of Meridian and 1 week before the formal Birch Community Capital launch, that Nora received a letter. Not an email. A letter, handwritten, on plain paper. In a handwriting she recognized the way you recognize something you have not seen in a long time, which is with the mixed quality of recognition and strangeness. It was from Vivian. She sat at her desk and read it without putting it down. It was 3 paragraphs. Not long. The first paragraph said that Vivian had heard about Birch Community Capital through the regional business coverage and had read the description of what it was designed to do. It said she had found herself thinking about something Nora had said in November, that she had built the company and Nora was going to keep it from being destroyed, and that she had been sitting with those words for 3 months. The second paragraph said that she was not writing to repair anything, that she understood some things did not get repaired, that she had spent 2 years after the divorce understanding the full architecture of the choices she had made and what they had cost, and that she was not under any illusion about the accounting. She said that understanding the architecture of your own choices was not the same as making amends, and that she was not confusing the two. The third, and the businesses and the neighborhoods and all the people in them whose days would look different in 5 years and 10 years because of decisions being made right now in the right order by the right people. She thought about what it had taken to get here. The full accounting of it, not the version that fit into a brief summary, but the real one, the specific long texture of 10 years of getting up and continuing. She thought about a November Tuesday and a leaking stool and a man with a hat in both hands, and about what one lifted hand could start, and about the fact that you never knew, when you were lifting it, that it was starting anything at all. You just knew that the seat was empty and someone needed one and you had it to offer. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.